Hello, everyone. My name's Dylan Atlas Baker. I'm going to be one of your hosts today for today's webinar. Really appreciate you all joining us today. Today's topic is managing multi-instance Looker deployments. And so the goal of this webinar is really to both outline the pros and cons of running a multi-instance Looker deployment, when you need it, when you don't, when you kind of really should go for it, when you shouldn't. And then if you are going to go for one, kind of practically speaking, how you should manage that, what that looks like, what tools you can use, how you should think about structuring projects, instances, all that stuff. So that's everything that we're going to be kind of covering today is going to be around that topic area. Before we jump in, I just want to quickly highlight some of our upcoming webinars. For those of you who were with us 2 weeks ago, thank you very much for attending and coming back. For those who aren't, this is a webinar series that we've recently kicked off. It is all focused on Looker. It's run by the team at Spectacles, and I'll talk about us in just a second. But really, these webinars aren't about Spectacles as a tool or anything like that. They're really for Looker practitioners, people who are in Looker, hands-on day-to-day, whether they're in-house consultancies, whatever it might be, to talk about practical advice for all of us that are using Looker day-to-day. And so they're every 2 weeks. We're going to take a quick break for Christmas, but we'll be back on January 11th, and we've got our upcoming webinars already scheduled. So we're going to talk about linting LookML. We're going to be talking about how to use the Looker API, and we're going to be talking about optimizing cost and speed using BigQuery and Looker together. So if you're interested in signing up for any of those, please go to spectacles.dev/webinars. You will also be able to watch videos for all of them after the fact. But the easiest way to get those is to register for the webinar, because we'll email those to everyone who has signed up after the fact, whether you've attended or not. Who are the two people in front of you today? So my name, I really need to get my new name on there. My name is Dylan Atlas Baker. I'm one of the co-founders here at Spectacles. I've been a long-time Looker user, all the way back to 2014. I've been in the space forever. Spectacles, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a CI tool built on top of Looker. So if you're making Looker changes, you're making changes to your warehouse that affect Looker, that's really kind of where we come in. And so if at any point you're interested in looking at us as a tool, just drop us a message, sign up for the demo. Very happy to chat through that. And today's presenter is Jim Torre, who's Director of Service Delivery at Bytecode, has been in the analytics space for 15 years, has been at Bytecode for 4 years. He just told me ahead of the call, as of this weekend, has really seen it all types of deployments at all sizes, and is going to be running us through everything today. I'm going to hand off to him in just a second. The final thing I want to mention, if you have any kind of just questions or things that commentary that other attendees may benefit from during the webinar, please use the chat for that. Make sure you're sending it to everyone and not just hosts and panelists, which I think is the default. So use that for kind of just chat during the presentation. And then if you have questions that you'd like Jim and I to answer at the end of the presentation, use the Q&A section for that. And so that will help us just kind of find the questions there. We will answer them after the presentation section. So anything about on this topic, if we don't get to it in these slides, please please send them our way. We're happy to answer them as we go. And so on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jim. I'm going to stop screen sharing and let him take it from here. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dylan. All right, so yeah, like Dylan said, I'm Jim Torre, the Director of Service Delivery at Bytecode.io. We are a strategic Looker partner with expertise in solution architecture, ETL, pipelines, data warehousing, and Looker development. Today, we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of having multiple Looker instances and how to manage multiple instances using tools like Looker Deployer. At Bytecode, we've assisted nearly 1,000 clients with their Looker implementations. Most of those customers do use a single Looker instance. And that's because off-the-shelf Looker already has a great suite of tools that enable you to manage your development workflow. You could use roles and permissions to limit end user access to LookML and other admin features. Development mode keeps in progress and untested LookML out of production. Using shared branches, each developer on your team could work in parallel without many conflicts. Content validator allows you to test code changes in a development branch to identify potential broken content before promoting to production. And there are many great tools that you could use with a single Looker instance. For instance, Spectacles could help you prevent your developers from promoting broken changes. This is what a typical development workflow for a single instance environment would look like. Your developers are writing LookML, committing changes into the branch, and when you're ready to promote, Looker bundles the merge to master and deploy to production in a single click. It's pretty simple. So why would you, or when would you, consider adding more instances? First thing would be is if you do require complete isolation of a production environment, you should get a separate production instance. If you need 100% uptime, no maintenance windows, you could get extra instances and set up a blue-green deployment. This scenario has 2 production instances in your deployment process, and it's just a task of swapping out URLs. If your end users need to review content changes by comparing to an existing dashboard, you might need additional environments. Users could then log into both instances in their browser, 2 browser tabs or browser windows, and visually compare both dashboards. If you need to run different code versions across environments, you're going to need extra instances. Common use case would be having a testing environment that uses a different database connection than what's used in production. And again, a similar scenario to my last point, where they could compare those things in parallel. And lastly, and probably the most common, is if you have an embedded use case and require testing before content is available to your end users. You're going to need an additional instance or more to set up those embedded dashboards, because the embed can only reference production mode in Looker and not a development branch. So if you wanted to test out some content changes in a dev environment through your embedded interface, those dashboards and corresponding LookML need to be deployed to production in order to do so. So with more than one Looker instance comes this task of synchronizing these instances. There's 2 areas that I want to address today, and that is code and content management. Your code is everything in your LookML project or Git repository. This includes your models, views, LookML dashboards, etc. Your content is everything that's contained in your folder structure, things like looks and user-defined dashboards. To manage code across multiple Looker instances, you have a few options. You can set up separate Git repos for each instance, and then write some custom scripts that copy code between each repo, but that could be fairly complex. You could use Looker's remote project import feature and import LookML from other projects. You still have multiple repos in this case, but utilizing some Looker tools in order to condense all those into a single project. Or you can use Looker's advanced deploy mode, which is a fairly recent feature in the past year or 2, that allows you to natively manage code across multiple instances using a single Git repository. Advanced deploy mode does allow you to specify a commit or a tag from any branch in the repository to deploy to production within a Looker instance. So that means, like I said before, that you could take that single Git repository, you may have many branches in there, or you may use some type of tagging structure, and you'd be able to select one of those and deploy it somewhere in your environment. This is going to replace the deploy button in the development IDE with a new tool called the Deployment Manager, where you could browse all the commits in your repository, select and deploy a commit and see which commit is currently deployed in production. The deployment manager also has webhooks and API endpoints that allow automation using your CI/CD tool of choice. So you can automate all that deployments via scripts. The other side of that, I mentioned you have code and content. The other side is content. So you're going to need to synchronize, or you may need to synchronize content across those multiple instances. If you choose to use just LookML dashboards, they're all contained in the Git repository. So there's very little you need to do here. The LookML dashboards are part of your code, and they would be deployed along with code. Pretty easy. Without any automation, if you're using a user-defined dashboards, you would need to manually recreate those user-defined dashboards in another instance. If you do start to bleed into that automation area, you can write custom scripts, call Looker's API. I know we're having a webinar coming up on Looker's API, but you could extract the dashboard content or Look content, anything from your Looker instance that comes out of that internal database that's inside of Looker. And when it's extracted, you could extract in something familiar like a JSON format. And then you could push that JSON into another Looker instance. So you could start building your automation workflow and your deployment workflow there. Or there's some tools that are already available, like Looker Deployer, that could help simplify some of those API calls. Going back, if you do choose to use LookML dashboards, I want to make sure you're aware of a few things. One is that LookML dashboards are created and maintained by developers and will require a user to have develop permissions and access to the development IDE. They are written in YAML syntax, not modern LookML, even though they're called LookML dashboards, and cannot be edited via the drag and drop interface that everybody's familiar with inside of Looker. They are stored, though, in that project repository, and therefore are already version controlled via your Git provider. When you first create a LookML dashboard, by default, it is accessible via the LookML dashboards folder, which is in the root of your Looker instance. But recently, Looker has added functionality to allow the ability to move LookML dashboards to other folders in your instance. And then you'd be able to apply the same content management and permissioning that you do to user-defined dashboards. And if you're wondering, LookML dashboards can be converted to and from user-defined dashboards. And we've had some Looker customers use this as an option to manage content because you can take that user-defined dashboard, script it so that it's converted into a LookML dashboard, put it in your Git repository, and then it works just like a LookML dashboard. And you can simplify the content management strategy. So this is what your development workflow might look like if you had 3 instances. A little bit more complex than our single instance workflow. Developers are still making commits in the development environment, but now you need to coordinate that through your Git provider so the code stays up to date in your other instances, and you'll have to build a process to move any content across those environments. This is where Looker Deployer can help. LDeploy is a, there we go, skip the slide. LDeploy is a Python package that you could use to export and import objects from Looker. It was created by Colin Postel from Looker, now Google, in 2019. And in 2021, Google asked Bytecode if we would take ownership and continue improving the package. Today, you could export and import almost everything from your Looker instance. Dashboards, looks, folders, boards, connections, model sets, permission sets, roles, groups, user attributes, and coming soon is a version that adds schedules and alerts. There's also a command to use Looker's deploy endpoints that I spoke about earlier with the advanced deployment that enables you to deploy code and content across multiple instances in a single script. And I'm going to show an example of that in a moment. While multi-instance workflows are the primary use case for Looker Deployer, We have used it to help customers automate backups and version control as well. Setting up Looker Deployer is much easier than it would be for you to write all of those native Looker API calls. You set up a config file here on the left with your environment information. You can have multiple environments, all with different credentials, and then you run your commands. Here's two examples. The first one exports everything from our shared folder in my dev environment to a folder in my local file system. So ldeploy, I'm saying content export, dev, folder 1 is my shared folder, and local target is just a folder on my local file system. I want to put all those JSON files in. The second example imports all the content from a public folder into my production environment. So I'm saying content import into prod, specifying the folder on my local file system, which was a subset of where I exported. So I only want to push back this one particular folder, and I'm pushing that up into my production environment. Here's a little bit more detailed of an example. This one of our engineers at Bytecode put together. This one uses GitHub Actions. So if you used GitHub Actions before, some of the syntax might look familiar. Let's walk through this together. So when a branch gets pushed with a release prefix, that's what triggers this process. We're using a Docker image that has ldeploy already installed. First, we're going to check out the repo. Then we're going to set up our config for both our dev and prod environments. The secrets are stored outside of the script, so we have to pull them in here. So we're setting up an environment, some environment variables, and pulling that information from our secret store. Then we're going to run our ldeploy content export from our dev environment, pulling that shared folder and putting it into a folder named content in the root of my local file system. Then up here on the top right, we're going to take all of those files that we just exported and commit them into the same repository that we use for LookML, and push them back into GitHub. Then we're going to use some curl commands to call the deploy webhook right down here. So we're doing some echoes and then actually running the curl commands where we are calling those deploy endpoints in our Looker environment and telling it that we want to deploy that release branch to our production environment. And then lastly, we're going to take all the content we exported earlier from dev and import it into prod. I'll answer some questions later if anybody has any questions on how that worked. So I just want to wrap things up by going over some best practices for managing multiple Looker instances. Like I mentioned earlier, use the same Git repository in all your instances. It's much easier to manage all your code in one repository. Enable advanced deploy mode and restrict developer access to each non-dev instance. You shouldn't be making any changes in any other environment except dev. Use the tools available to you. You might already have tools like Jenkins or Circle CI to manage deployments today. If not, your Git provider should have a suite like GitHub Actions, which I showed before, or GitLab CI/CD. Use other tools where appropriate. Spectacles has a great testing suite, and Lambs enforces best practice style guides. Looker defaults to using IDs for content, which aren't persistent when migrating across environments. So you can use dashboard slugs, which is available via the Looker API instead, so that you have stable URLs no matter which environment you're using. And lastly, if you're going to go through all this trouble of setting up multiple environments, you might as well version control all your content so that you have a method of rolling back an instance to a previous state. Thank you, and I'll hand things back to Dylan for our Q&A.
Thanks, Jim. Awesome. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. If anyone has anything they'd like Jim, or I guess to a lesser degree myself, to answer on the topic. There's a Q&A functionality right at the bottom of Zoom. We've got a couple of questions already in, but fire away. We'd love to kind of answer any questions you have on the topic. Jim, the first one I'm going to send your way is from someone on the call who said, can you go into more detail on blue-green deployments? So you talked about blue-green deployments and I guess used that term early on in the presentation. Can you just talk a little bit more about kind of what that refers to, and I guess in general, in both in the context of Looker?
Yeah. Excuse me. So blue-green deployments, our definition is related to uptime. So you have an environment where you're required to have near 100% or 100% uptime. And setting up a blue-green deployment means having two instances that are acting as a production instance. And one is, let's say it's your green, is available to users. And you need to deploy the next version of your code. And you don't want to have any downtime during that switch. So you don't want to go through this process, like I showed before, of pushing all your code and content into that green environment. So what you do is you create a mirror of your green environment called blue, and then start loading up all that content and code into your blue environment. And when you're ready to make the switch, whether it's via URL or you could do a DNS, or there's plenty of ways you could switch these environments. But you would just make that switch from green to blue. And now everybody is looking at blue. It takes milliseconds to make that transition, and your end users wouldn't notice that anything changed. And then you pull everything back from blue down to green, so you have a mirror environment, or the green instance could sit for a little while to be your rollback strategy. So if you had an issue when everything moved over to blue and you need to roll back to green, it's as easy as just switching it back. So a little bit more maintenance and coordination from like the CI/CD perspective, but a lot of value for your end users because they don't see any downtime, and updates are immediate.
And Jim, just a follow-up, this is from me at this point. When using something like Looker Deployer, what are the, obviously you're going to have all the content prepped in your dev or your staging instance. What's the risk of downtime? You're talking about blue-green deploy across like two separate production-esque Looker instances. What's the risk of downtime when using something like Looker Deployer?
Yeah, so Looker Deployer is making all those API calls still, and it depends on how much code and content you really need to push. Those API calls can take seconds, and if you have a lot of data, it could take minutes. So it all depends on the scale of your deployment and how quickly you need that transition to take place. If you don't have many explorers, you don't have many dashboards, you could probably get away with just pushing everything into a single production environment. But if that process is going to take a period of time that's not ideal for your end users, you may want to set up this type of strategy.
Cool. We've got a question from Yasha, one of the attendees. The question is, does advanced deploy your commits across instances? I thought it was only to deploy to the production mode of your instance instead of dev to prod instances. So I think partly the question is just kind of, can you go into a little bit more detail as to kind of practically how advanced deploy works in a multi-instance setup?
Yeah. So advanced deploy, like I have here in point 2, you're setting up in every non-dev instance. And then you're coordinating all of those calls. So if you needed to deploy a specific version, say in your staging environment, you would call the deploy endpoint in staging to push a particular commit into that staging environment. If you wanted to push something to prod, you're calling advanced deploy in prod. So it depends on which instance you're deploying to and where advanced deploy has been enabled. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yasha, if you have a follow-up, just feel free to type it into the Q&A. Nick is asking, what are your recommendations to manage connections, group roles, model sets across multiple instances automatically? You mentioned that Looker Deployer can do much more than content. It can do kind of all of these non-version controllable assets, I guess, or things within a Looker instance. How do you generally recommend managing all of that?
A lot of the time, those are single pushes. We don't see many customers, Looker customers, using the ability to push things like connections on a regular basis. The only example I could think of there is if you had like a hub and spoke environment where maybe you had multiple instances across different regions around the world, and you needed to be able to push things out maybe on a release schedule. It's not as common, I guess is the simplest way to put it, to say I'm going to push a connection every time I'm going to push a new version of LookML. And so it becomes a different process than your regular deployment process. So setting up a separate routine that handles connections or users or roles would be in your probably your best interest. So things aren't, using up that extra time for each deployment to just overwrite the same connections that you're setting those up in separate jobs.
Perfect. We got a question from Anthony Billett. And the question is, if we have an internal facing analytics instance and an external facing analytics instance, how easy is it to have them share the same Git repo? And he gives an example saying, in the external instance, you'd likely want an access filter on explorers, but you wouldn't want those in the internal use case. But, it's mandatory really in the external use case so that people are only seeing the data that's pertinent to them. And so how easily and what have you seen in your experience of kind of internal and external Looker instances using the same code base for both those use cases?
I'd have to go back on that one, Anthony, just to double check. But things like access filters and access grants may be able to be controlled via like refinements or extends. And so the way I'm thinking about it is you'd have your base Git repo with all your views and explorers defined in there. And then you could use the remote project import feature to pull it into your second environment with some either refinements or extends to apply those type of security controls. I have to test that out to make sure what I'm thinking is going to work properly, but that would be the first way I would try to tackle that.
Awesome. Got a question from Jeff. Using a single Git repository for multiple instances. So as kind of we've been talking about today, would I need a development master branch and a production master branch and effectively a master branch for each instance? So I guess that's the first question. Then two, how should I think about protecting these branches?
Hey, Jeff, that's actually where advanced deploy comes in. In your other instances, so your non-dev instances, you don't have a master branch set up in those environments because you don't have developer access in those environments. So you're utilizing the advanced deploy feature to deploy code directly from whatever branch or commit you want in the repository to the production mode in those non-dev instances. So you're kind of skipping that step of needing to define a master branch in each of those instances, and it's just not necessary.
We've got a couple more questions here. Another one from Yasha. The last bullet point on the best practice slide talked about creating version control of the content. So you mentioned kind of if you're going to all this effort, you might as well create backups of your content. The question is this more than just creating LookML versions of the dashboards to manage their versions? So basically kind of what does that backup process look like? Where does it get stored? What do those kind of files kind of practically look like?
Yeah, we've done a couple different versions of this, and you could take a look at our Bytecode Git repo. I'll have Dylan put that in the notes on the webinar, but we have done one with LookML version control. So when a dashboard gets changed, exporting that to a LookML dashboard file, and then putting that LookML dashboard file in your Git repository. And then every time a change happens, you just add another commit to that same file, showing the changes, and then you have a rollback plan for that particular command dashboard. It could work the same way, though, if you chose to use the JSON approach with like Looker Deployer or Looker's API. You just extracting it in JSON format and following the same process, checking it into your repo so that you have the different versions of that file, and then have some type of process that allows you to either roll back or select which one you want to deploy.
Awesome. And then the final one we've got here, the question is, what are the ways in which the LookML developers, the person kind of in the IDE doing the development themselves, is most affected by having multiple instances? And so I think the question here is like, once you've done the kind of what feels like a one-off task of getting GitHub Actions set up and getting your advanced deploy, there's kind of a one-off of getting that all set up. What is the impact on the developer who, someone who's maybe less from an engineering background, more from an analyst background, who's kind of doing the day-to-day development in Looker? Is their experience the same? Is their experience different? Kind of what's the impact there?
It depends. So your Looker developer is going to be impacted depending on how your business and end users want to manage the Looker environments. The script I presented a slide back is assuming that everybody's making changes in a development environment and then pushing everything into a production environment. We have seen some customers, though, that like their end users to have the ability to change content because it's so easy to use the Looker UI to change dashboards in the production environment. So now you need to coordinate, okay, I need to get those dashboards from production back into dev, make sure I have the latest version, make sure I'm not overwriting changes when I push it back into prod. So they're going back to what I said, like it depends on where your company wants to be and how they want to manage those Looker instances. And you could figure out the scripts to make it as minimal of an impact to your developers as possible. But know that there's going to have to be some process defined.
We've actually had a couple more come through, and we've got a bit of time, so I'm going to try to get through a couple more of these. This one feels like possibly a loaded question, but we'll ask it anyway. Has there been any update if Looker Deployer will be integrated as a standard part of Looker, or is it likely to continue as kind of a separate service as it exists today?
We haven't received any word about it being included as part of the Looker roadmap. I would say keep an eye on release notes and Google's conference every year. That's usually when they make those type of announcements. We are continuing improving on Looker Deployer, adding new features and functionality. There's been some conversations about having it set up as like an extension framework application that you can install into your Looker instance, which would make it a little bit easier to manage instead of via the command line. But nothing about it being incorporated into the standard product as of now.
Perfect. And then I think just looking at time, I think one more we're going to take. Can you speak more on how to create dashboard slugs for stable URL mappings across instances? So you mentioned that by default, kind of dashboards get basically an integer ID of whatever number. You can tell how long someone's been using Looker by just how high their dashboard ID number is. Can you just talk a little bit more about kind of how to create those unique slugs for them across instances?
Yeah. So Looker has a feature. It's like I said, only available in the Looker API. So by default, like Dylan said, and I said before, the dashboard has an ID. So every new dashboard you create, it auto increments dashboard 1, 2, 3, and so on. But in the API, there is a slug that's available as part of that dashboard. It gets like a GUID. It's a random generated string when the dashboard's created. Might be ABC 1, 2, 3, something like that. But that is overwritable. So if you're using Looker's API, you could then change that slug to something more recognizable, like marketing dashboard. So your instance, customer.looker.com/dashboard/marketing dashboard. is something that is possible in your environment. And then when you move that dashboard from one instance to another, that slug is stable. It doesn't get automatically regenerated like the dashboard ID would. And so you could say, dev.looker.com marketing dashboard and prod.looker.com marketing dashboard could be the same piece of content in two environments.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We're going to stop the questions there. If anyone, I know there's a couple of questions that we haven't been able to get to. Spectacles actually has a Slack community for both the Spectacles tool, but also just Looker users generally. I'm going to just grab the link, which I should have done before. But if you do want to have more of these, if you want to have your questions answered, do join there and ask in there. We are very happy to both answer questions ourselves, but also facilitate conversations between Looker practitioners. And so I'm going to drop that right here in the chat for everyone to see. Please join us there if you do want to ask any follow-up questions or anything like that. That is it for us today. But before we head off, I just want to quickly highlight once again, wrong slide, the upcoming webinars. So that's it for us before Christmas this year. So we're going to take a nice break over the next 4 weeks, but we're back in 4 weeks on the 11th of January for linting LookML with LAMs and LookML style. LookML style is actually our Spectacles' new LookML linter. So we're going to be kind of unveiling that, talking about that, and showing a demo of that hopefully on the 11th. So please join us for that. And then we've got an introduction to Looker API and optimizing costs and speed with BigQuery and Looker after that. So if those are of interest, please just head to spectacles.dev/webinars and sign up for the one that you're interested in. Additionally, if you're attending this and you're thinking, hey, we've been doing this really cool thing with Looker, there's this topic I'd love to talk about, please get in touch. We're going to run these every 2 weeks kind of in perpetuity. And so we'd love to get more interest from kind of consultancies, Looker customers, whatever it might be, on topics that you'd like to talk about. And so if there is something of interest, please just drop us a message. We'd love to chat. You can either email us directly or get in touch with the Spectacles website or through our Slack community, to which I've just shared the link. And so that's going to be it today. As I said before, if you're ever interested in a demo of Spectacles, you want to kind of improve some of the testing around your Looker instance, also definitely get in touch. And so the final thing today, a big thank you to Jim Torre for all the kind of work put into this presentation. If you're doing anything complex with multi-instance, you're thinking about it, I'm sure the team at Bytecode will also be very happy to chat. That's all from us today. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.